The wind across Midgard had changed. Kratos felt it the moment he stepped onto the frozen shore of the Lake of Nine. The air carried something wrong, not the familiar bite of Norse winter, but a pressure that made his jaw tighten. The war was over. Ragnarok had come and gone, leaving the Nine Realms to heal in whatever broken peace remained. Yet here, standing at the water's edge with Atreus beside him, Kratos knew peace was a lie, men told themselves between battles. The sky cracked. Not thunder, not lightning. The sound was sharper, cleaner, like bone splitting under pressure. Kratos' hand moved to the Leviathan axe strapped to his back, fingers closing around the grip as his eyes tracked upward. Above the lake, reality tore. The rift spread like branches of Yggdrasil itself, glowing veins of pale gold light threading through the gray clouds. The tree between worlds had been wounded during Ragnarok, its roots and branches fractured across the realms. This was something else, something deliberate. "Father." Atreus' voice was tight. The boy knew the young man had seen enough impossible things to know when the world was being rewritten. "What is that?" Kratos didn't answer. He watched the light intensify, watched the air around the lake shimmer and bend. The surface of the water began to freeze in patterns too geometric to be natural, forming concentric circles that spread outward from a central point. Where the circles met, pillars of ice rose from the depths. They climbed toward the sky, their surfaces carved with runes that pulsed in rhythm with the fractured sky above. The structure emerged slowly, as if reality itself was reluctant to make room for it. Stone materialized between the ice pillars, dark granite veined with silver, etched with symbols Kratos recognized from no pantheon he had destroyed. The pillars became columns. The columns became walls. Within minutes, an arena stood in the center of the Lake of Nine, its architecture brutal and efficient. No decoration, no worship. Just a killing floor suspended between worlds, anchored to Midgard, like a stake driven through the heart of the realm. This is wrong. Atreus took a step forward, his bow already in hand. We need to wait. Kratos' command was quiet, but it stopped Atreus mid-stride. The boy had learned when to listen. Kratos narrowed his eyes, studying the arena. The runes on its surface weren't Norse. They weren't Greek. They were older, or perhaps newer, something that existed outside the mythologies he'd bled through. The wrongness of it settled in his chest like a stone. Then the sound came. A horn deep and resonant that rolled across the frozen lake like the voice of a mountain given breath. Kratos had heard that sound before in the myths Mimir had recounted during their journey. Gjallarhorn, the horn that heralded the end of worlds. A figure materialized at the arena's edge, standing atop one of the stone walls. Tall, draped in armor that gleamed silver and gold, with hair the color of fresh snow falling past his shoulders. The man, the god, held the horn to his lips, and when he lowered it, his voice carried across the lake with the same impossible clarity. Behold. The word echoed, multiplying across the water and the ice until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. The Ragnarok Council convenes. Hear the law. Know the terms. Kratos felt his muscles coil. His hand remained on the axe, though he made no move to draw it. Not yet. He needed to understand what he was facing before he decided how to kill it. The figure on the wall spread his arms wide, addressing an audience that didn't exist. Or perhaps one that existed in places Kratos couldn't see. I am Heimdall Herald, of the God's Guardian, of the Gjallarhorn, and voice of this sacred tribunal. The Nine Realms stand accused. The proliferation of divine warfare threatens the very fabric of existence. The Council has gathered to determine whether humanity and those who shelter them deserve to continue. Atreus inhaled sharply. They want to destroy Midgard. Kratos said nothing. His mind was already calculating distances, angles, the time it would take to cross the ice and reach that wall. But something held him still. He had fought gods before. He had killed pantheons. He knew the difference between a threat and a trap. This felt like both. Heimdall's voice rose theatrical and precise. The law is ancient. The law is absolute. 13 champions of the gods shall face 13 champions of humanity in single combat. Each battle fought to the death. The side that claims 7 victories shall determine the fate of the accused. The air around the arena shimmered. Figures began to appear translucent at first, then solidifying, standing on elevated platforms that ringed the killing floor. Gods. Kratos recognized some of them. Odin draped in his dark cloak, his single eye gleaming with cold interest. Thor massive and silent, his hammer resting against one shoulder. Others he didn't know. Gods from pantheons he'd never encountered, their forms and power radiating outward like heat from a forge. The council has spoken. Heimdall's declaration cut through the rising murmur of divine voices. Humanity will present its champions. The tournament begins at the next dawn. Prepare yourselves, mortals. Your survival depends on blood and will. Kratos exhaled slowly. The arena wasn't a threat to be destroyed. It was a stage. A deliberate construct designed to force a specific kind of conflict. He recognized the shape of it, gods drunk on their own authority, deciding the worth of lives they'd never lived. He'd seen it in Olympus. He'd seen it in Asgard. The faces changed. The arrogance remained. Father. Atreus moved closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. We can't let them do this. We won't. Kratos turned away from the arena, his gaze sweeping across the frozen lake. But not by charging him blind. Before either of them could move, another figure appeared, not on the divine platforms, but standing directly on the ice between them and the arena. A woman tall and armored, her blonde hair pulled back in a severe braid. Her presence carried weight, not the crushing dominance of divine power, but something sharper. Purpose. She looked at Kratos with eyes that held no fear, only assessment. Kratos. Her voice was calm, measured. I am Brunhilde. I represent humanity in this tribunal. Kratos' hand didn't leave his axe. Then humanity chose poorly. A flicker of something amusement perhaps crossed her face. Bold words from a demigod. I am no god. No. Brunhilde stepped forward, her boots crunching against the ice. You were born mortal. You were made into something else through suffering and choice. That makes you exactly what I need. Atreus raised his bow slightly. What do you want? Brunhilde didn't look at him. Her focus remained on Kratos, unwavering. I want you to fight for humanity. The council has granted me 13 champions to stand against the gods. You will be one of them. No. The word came without hesitation. You haven't heard my offer. I don't need to. Kratos turned his back on her, gesturing for Atreus to follow. Find another killer for your arena. They'll destroy Midgard. Brunhilde's voice sharpened. The council won't stop with judgment. If humanity loses, they'll erase the 9 realms entirely. Every man, woman, and child. Your son included. Kratos stopped. The ice beneath his feet cracked softly, a hairline fracture spreading outward from where he stood. He didn't turn around. Brunhilde continued her words, deliberate. You've spent your life running from what you were. Fighting gods, killing tyrants, trying to teach your son that power isn't everything. Here's your chance to prove it. Fight not as a god, not as a monster, but as what you chose to become. Fight as a man with something to protect. The silence stretched. Atreus looked between them, tension coiling in his shoulders. Kratos felt the weight of the offer settle over him like armor. He'd sworn he was done with divine games, done with arenas and spectacles. But the woman was right about one thing: he had something to protect now. Someone. And he'd burn the realms down before he let them take that away. He turned, meeting Brunhilde's gaze. What are the terms? She didn't smile, but something shifted in her expression. Respect, perhaps? Single combat, one-on-one, to the death. The gods have already chosen their fighters. You'll face one of them. If you win, humanity gains a point. If you lose, I won't. Confident. Brunhilde tilted her head slightly. The council will contest your eligibility. You're the son of Zeus. Divine blood makes you human. Kratos stepped forward, closing the distance between them. I earned my strength. I chose my path. If your gods have a problem with that, they can settle it in the arena. For the first time, Brunhilde smiled. It was a small thing, sharp as a blade. Good. Then let's go make them regret their rules. Behind them, Heimdall's voice rang out again across the lake, proclaiming the glory of the gods and the inevitability of divine justice. Kratos barely heard it. His mind was already shifting into the space it occupied before every battle, cold, focused, calculating. He'd killed gods before. He'd do it again. Not for sport, not for revenge, for necessity. Atreus fell into step beside him as they walked toward the arena. You sure about this? Kratos didn't answer immediately. He looked at his son, strong, capable, alive, and felt the weight of every choice that had brought them here. The boy deserved better than another war. But the boy also deserved to live. Sometimes those two truths couldn't coexist. Stay in the stands, Kratos said finally. Do not interfere. Father, you are not ready for this. He softened his tone just slightly. And I need to know you're safe. Atreus opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. He nodded once, tight and unhappy, but obedient. Kratos felt a small measure of relief. The boy had learned restraint. That would keep him alive. They reached the edge of the arena. Up close, the structure was even more imposing, walls that seemed to absorb light runes that pulsed with a rhythm Kratos felt in his bones. Brunhilde gestured toward a set of stairs carved into the stone leading down into what looked like preparation chambers beneath the main floor. The first challenge won't be in the arena, she said. It'll be in the council chambers. They'll try to disqualify you before you ever set foot on the killing floor. Be ready to defend your right to fight. Kratos grunted. Let them try. As he descended into the arena's depths, he heard Heimdall's voice one more time, echoing through stone and ice. Let the gods bear witness. Let humanity tremble. The tournament of Ragnarok begins. Kratos' grip tightened on his axe. The gods would bear witness, all right. They'd witness what happened when they threatened the wrong man's son. The chamber beneath the arena smelled of stone and old ice. Kratos descended the stairs with Brunhilde ahead of him and Atreus silent at his back. The walls here bore the same alien runes, as the surface their glow providing the only light in the narrow passage. Each step echoed, swallowed by darkness, that felt deliberately constructed. This wasn't a place meant for comfort. It was a throat leading to judgment. The passage opened into a vast circular room. The ceiling arched high overhead, carved from a single piece of black granite that seemed to drink in what little light reached it. At the center of the chamber stood a raised platform, and ringing it were 12 stone thrones arranged in a perfect circle. 11 were already occupied. Kratos recognized some of the figures seated there. Odin leaned forward in his throne fingers, steepled beneath his chin, his single eye fixed on the entrance with predatory focus. Thor sat to his right, massive arms crossed over his chest, expression unreadable. To the left, a goddess Kratos didn't recognize, dark-skinned and regal, wearing the symbols of Egyptian divinity, watched with cool detachment. Others filled the remaining seats, representatives of pantheons, scattered across existence, each radiating the particular arrogance that came with immortality. The 12th throne remained empty, waiting. Heimdall stood at the platform's edge, his silver armor catching the rune light in sharp angles. When he saw Brunhilde enter with Kratos behind her, his expression shifted into something theatrical, a ringmaster preparing to announce the main event. The Valkyrie brings her champion. His voice filled the chamber, amplified by acoustics that turned every word into a pronouncement. Brunhilde of the Choosers of the Slain, advocate for humanity, presents her candidate for the roster of 13. Brunhilde stepped onto the platform without hesitation. Her spine was straight, her chin raised, every inch of her posture radiating defiance wrapped in protocol. Kratos followed his boot, striking stone with deliberate weight. He didn't bow, didn't acknowledge the assembled gods with anything more than a sweeping glance that cataloged threats and calculated distances. Atreus remained at the chamber's edge, positioned hid near the entrance. Kratos had instructed him clearly, observe, don't participate. The boy's presence was a tether, a reminder of what mattered beyond the coming argument. Kratos felt that tether pulled taut as he took his position beside Brunhilde. Odin spoke first. His voice was dry, ancient, carrying the weight of schemes layered upon schemes. Brunhilde, you test our patience. The rules were clear. 13 humans to stand against 13 gods. You bring us a demigod, the son of Zeus himself. I bring you a warrior who began as mortal. Brunhilde's response came quick and sharp. His origins are human. What came after was earned through suffering, not inheritance. Semantics. The Egyptian goddess leaned back in her throne, her tone dismissive. Divine blood flows through his veins. That makes him ineligible. Your first choice is rejected. Murmurs rippled through the assembled gods. Some nodded in agreement. Others watched with the detached interest of beings who found mortal struggles amusing. Kratos remained still, his breathing steady, his mind already working through the shape of this trap. They wanted him dismissed. They feared what he represented, not his strength, but what his strength proved. That gods could bleed, could fall, could be wrong. Brunhilde turned to face the council fully, and when she spoke, her voice carried the precision of a blade, finding the gap in armor. You fear him. That's why you want him disqualified. We fear nothing. Thor's growl was low, dangerous. We enforce the rules. Then let's discuss the rules. Brunhilde clasped her hands behind her back, the posture of an advocate beginning their argument. This tournament was created to determine humanity's worth, to test whether mortals deserve to survive or be erased. You claim Kratos is divine. I claim he is the perfect representation of what humanity can become when it refuses to accept powerlessness. He is Zeus's son. Odin's fist struck the armrest of his throne. That fact cannot be argued away with clever words. No, Brunhilde agreed. But the circumstance of his birth is irrelevant to who he became. Kratos didn't ask for divine parentage. He was born mortal, lived as mortal, suffered as mortal. Every ounce of strength he possesses was paid for in blood and choice. If you reject him for the accident of his bloodline, you're admitting that birth matters more than will. That destiny trumps decision. The chamber fell silent. Kratos watched the gods exchange glances, saw calculation flicker across immortal faces. Brunhilde was good at this, turning their own prejudices into weapons, forcing them to confront contradictions they preferred to ignore. The Egyptian goddess Isis Kratos, realized from the symbols adorning her throne, spoke with measured calm. An interesting argument, but it doesn't change the fundamental problem. This tournament is meant to pit pure humanity against divinity. Introducing someone with inherent advantages corrupts the test. Then level the field. Brunhilde's response was immediate, as if she'd anticipated this exact objection. Create conditions that negate any so-called divine advantage. Make him fight on purely mortal terms. Odin's eye narrowed. Explain. The Ragnarok field. Brunhilde gestured toward the empty throne, and as she did, runes began to spiral upward from the floor, forming complex patterns in the air. An arena modification that suppresses divine gifts. Any fighter who steps onto the battlefield will be reduced to their fundamental essence skill with physical ability. No blessings from pantheons, no inherited immortality. Just the warriors stripped to their core. Kratos felt a cold assessment settle over him. She was offering to nerf him, to take away whatever advantages his bloodline provided and leave him with only what he'd built through experience. It was clever. It addressed the god's concerns while keeping him in the fight. But it also meant walking into battle deliberately weakened. He didn't object. If anything, the idea appealed to some part of him that had never trusted power he hadn't earned. Thor leaned forward, interest sparking in his eyes. The field would affect both combatants equally, Brunhilde confirmed. God and mortal alike reduced to their truest form. And his weapons. Isis gestured toward the Leviathan axe on Kratos' back. Those carry enchantments. Divine craftsmanship. Will the field negate those as well? It will. Brunhilde's tone remained steady. Unless we apply a Volunder. The word sent another ripple through the council. Kratos had heard Mimir mention Volunder before, a Valkyrie technique that bound a warrior's weapon to their soul, transforming it into something that transcended normal enchantment. A divine-grade armament that existed as an extension of Imweld rather than external magic. Odin's laugh was bitter. Now the truth emerges. You want to grant him a Volunder, to arm him with a Valkyrie's blessing before sending him into battle. Not a blessing, Brunhilde corrected. A legitimization. The Ragnarok field will strip away external magic. A Volunder doesn't add power, it transforms existing weapons into forms that can survive the field's suppression. It's a technical adjustment, not an advantage. It's cheating dressed in clever language. Thor's voice carried the weight of distant thunder. You're trying to smuggle divine aid into a contest meant to exclude it. Brunhilde met his glare without flinching. I'm trying to make the fight possible. Without Volunder, Kratos enters the arena with weapons that won't function. He'd be fighting bare-handed against opponents wielding divine armaments. Is that the fairness you're demanding? Or do you simply want to guarantee his death? The accusation hung in the air. Kratos watched the gods shift in their seats, uncomfortable with having their motivations named so plainly. They wanted humanity to fight. They wanted the spectacle of mortal struggle. But they also wanted to win, and stacking conditions against their opponents was easier than admitting they feared losing. Isis stood from her throne, moving with the fluid grace of river water. A compromise. We accept the Ragnarok field. We accept a minimal Volunder, enough to preserve his weapon's basic function, nothing more. But in exchange, Kratos must accept one additional condition. Kratos spoke for the first time since entering the chamber. His voice was low, rough, carrying none of Brunhilde's eloquence, but all the weight of lived violence. Name it. If you win your fight, the Council will acknowledge you as a legitimate champion of humanity. Your victory will count toward the 7 needed for survival. Isis's gaze locked onto his, searching. But if you lose, humanity forfeits not just 1 point, but 2. Your failure will cost them double. Do you accept this burden? The silence that followed was absolute. Kratos felt every eye in the chamber fix on him, waiting for hesitation, for doubt, for some sign that the terms were too steep. He thought of Atreus watching from the shadows. Thought of every fight he'd survived through nothing but refusal to fall. Thought of the fact that he'd never entered a battle expecting to lose. I accept. Brunhilde exhaled slowly, relief flickering across her features too quickly to be called a crack in composure. Odin leaned back in his throne, expression unreadable. Thor grunted either approval or disappointment, impossible to tell which. Then we have terms. Isis returned to her seat, settling into it with finality. Kratos, son of Zeus, will represent humanity under the following conditions. First, the Ragnarok field will suppress all divine inheritance during combat. Second, he will receive a minimal Volunder to preserve his weapon's integrity. Third, his defeat will count as 2 losses for humanity. These conditions are binding and irrevocable. Does the Council agree? A chorus of affirmations rose from the assembled gods. Some grudging, some satisfied, all carrying the tone of beings who believed they'd just secured an advantage. Kratos recognized the calculation. They thought the double loss penalty made his participation a liability. They thought the field suppression would reduce him to something manageable. They were wrong. But he'd let them believe otherwise until the moment he proved it. Heimdall stepped forward, raising the Gjallar horn. Then let it be recorded. Kratos of Sparta the Ghost, the God-Slayer, shall stand as humanity's champion. His first battle will commence at dawn. The Council will select his opponent before the sun rises. Brunhilde turned to Kratos as the gods began to disperse their forms, fading from the thrones one by one, returning to whatever distant places they'd gathered from. Her expression was carefully neutral, but something moved beneath it. Respect, maybe, or shared understanding of what they'd just committed to. The Volunder will happen now, she said quietly. We don't have much time. The ritual is quick, but it's not painless. Pain is irrelevant. Kratos unslung the Leviathan axe from his back, holding it in both hands. The weapon's familiar weight settled against his palms like an old conversation. Do what needs to be done. Brunhilde led him to a smaller chamber adjacent to the council room. The space was circular, its floor carved with interlocking patterns that reminded Kratos of the world tree's roots. At the center stood a raised platform, and surrounding it, ethereal forms began to materialize. Other Valkyries, he realized, summoned to witness or assist the ritual. Place your weapons on the platform, Brunhilde instructed. The Volunder will bind them to your essence. They'll become extensions of your will, capable of manifesting even within the field suppression. But understand, this isn't a power increase. It's a transformation. Your weapons will be no stronger than they are now. They'll simply be recognized as part of you rather than external tools. Kratos laid the Leviathan axe on the platform, then drew the blades of chaos from beneath his arm guards. The chains rattled as he set them beside the axe, their flames dimming to embers in the runelight. He stepped back, watching as the Valkyries began to move in synchronized patterns around the platform, their voices rising in a language that predated words. The air thickened. Pressure built against Kratos' chest, and he felt something reach into him, not physically but deeper, touching the part of him that had survived every betrayal, every loss, every impossible fight. The weapons on the platform began to glow, not with external magic, but with something that felt like recognition. Like the metal itself was learning his shape, his will, the countless scars his hands had earned wielding them. Pain came next. Not the sharp agony of injury, but a deeper ache, the sensation of things being rewritten at a fundamental level. Kratos' breathing remained steady. He'd endured worse, had welcomed worse when it served a purpose. This pain had purpose. It was the price of legitimacy, of proving to the gods that he belonged in their arena, not because of what he was born as, but because of what he'd chosen to become. The light intensified. The Valkyrie's song reached a crescendo, and then with a sound like a bell, struck once in infinite darkness, the ritual completed. The weapons lay unchanged on the platform, same metal, same edge, same weight. But Kratos felt the difference. They were his now in a way they hadn't been before. Not just tools he wielded, but reflections of the will that refused to break, no matter how many times the world tried. Brunhilde lowered her hands, the other Valkyries fading back into whatever realm they'd emerged from. It's done. When you enter the field, those weapons will answer to you. Nothing more, nothing less. Kratos retrieved the axe and blades, securing them in their familiar positions. The weight felt right, felt honest. What happens now? Now we wait for the council to choose your opponent. Brunhilde moved toward the chamber's exit. They'll pick someone designed to break you. Someone who represents everything you're supposed to fear or hate. That's how these games work. Let them. Kratos followed her back toward the main corridor. I've killed worse than whatever they send. They emerged into the passage leading to the arena's upper levels. Atreus was waiting, tension written in every line of his posture. When he saw Kratos, some of that tension eased, but not all of it. Did they accept you? The boy asked. They accepted the terms. Kratos placed a hand on his son's shoulder, brief and heavy. You'll stay in the stands. You'll watch. You will not interfere no matter what happens. Father, this is not a discussion. Kratos' grip tightened slightly, then released. I need to know you're safe. That's not negotiable. Atreus looked like he wanted to argue. But something in Kratos' expression, maybe the exhaustion underneath the determination, maybe the unspoken fear that he couldn't afford to voice, stopped him. The boy nodded once, jaw tight. I'll stay in the stands, he said quietly. But you better not lose. The corner of Kratos' mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close enough to count. I won't. They ascended toward the arena proper, following Brunhilde through passages that grew wider and brighter as they climbed. Other figures moved through the corridors, now human champions Kratos assumed, gathered from across history and myth to fight for their species' survival. He didn't speak to them, didn't need to. They were all walking the same path toward the same end. The passage opened onto the arena floor, and Kratos stopped at the threshold. The killing ground stretched before him, a perfect circle of dark stone, unmarked and waiting. The stands rose in tiers beyond, it already beginning to fill with spectators. Gods on one side, their divine radiance making the air shimmer. Humans on the other, smaller, quieter, but no less intense in their attention. Above it all, the fractured sky of Midgard bled through the arena's open roof, reminder that this place existed between worlds anchored to reality by will and runework. Heimdall stood at the arena's center, the Gjallarhorn gleaming in his hands. When he saw Kratos emerge, his expression shifted into that familiar theatrical glee. "The challenger approaches." His voice boomed across the stands, drawing every eye. Kratos of Sparta, the ghost, the god-slayer once divine, now mortal by choice, he enters the Ragnarok arena to prove that humanity is more than flesh and fear. The divine side of the stands erupted in derisive laughter. The human side remained silent, watching with the grim intensity of people who knew their lives hung on the outcome of violence they couldn't control. Kratos ignored both reactions. He walked to the edge of the arena floor, but didn't step onto it. Not yet. The fight hadn't been announced. The opponent hadn't been named. Brunhilde appeared at his side, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "Whatever they send, remember, you're not fighting to prove you're strong. You're fighting to prove strength means something when it's chosen." Kratos didn't respond. He simply watched the arena, watched the empty space where his opponent would soon stand, and let the familiar coldness settle over him. The coldness that came before every battle. The space in his mind where doubt didn't exist, where pain was just information, where death was simply a problem to be solved through superior violence and unbreakable will. Heimdall raised the Gjallarhorn to his lips. The sound that emerged was deeper than thunder, older than mountains, carrying across the arena and beyond into the fabric of the 9 realms themselves. "Let the council's judgment be known." Heimdall's pronouncement echoed into sudden silence. "Let humanity's champion face his trial. The first battle of Ragnarok will now commence." The empty throne in the council chamber materialized above the arena floor, massive and spectral, and seated upon it was a figure Kratos hadn't seen before. Tall, draped in robes that seemed woven from shadows, and starlight face half hidden behind a mask of silver, inscribed with the same alien runes that covered the arena walls. "Behold!" Heimdall gestured toward the figure. "The council sends forth verdict. God of judgment, keeper of cosmic law, the arbiter who cannot err. He who decides the worth of all things shall test the ghost of Sparta. He shall determine whether mortal will can stand against divine decree." The figure verdict stood from his throne. As he rose, the throne dissolved, and he descended toward the arena floor, as if walking down invisible stairs. His movements were deliberate, almost mechanical, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. When his boots touched stone, the entire arena seemed to hold its breath. Kratos stepped forward onto the killing ground and felt the Ragnarok field activate. It was like stepping into water, a pressure that covered every inch of him, pressing inward, searching for anything that didn't belong to his core self. He felt divine blood in his veins recognized and suppressed. Felt the lingering blessings of Olympus, identified and stripped away. In seconds, the field reduced him to what he'd been before gods had noticed him, a Spartan warrior with nothing but skill, will, and weapons that answered to no power but his own choice to wield them. It felt right. Felt clean. Verdict stood across from him, 30 paces distant. When he spoke, his voice carried no emotion, no inflection, just the flat certainty of pronouncement. "Freedom is error. I will correct it." Kratos drew the Leviathan axe from his back, feeling the weapon's weight settle into his grip. The Volunder had worked the axe remained solid, real, answering to his hand despite the field's suppression. He didn't respond to Verdict's declaration. Didn't need to. His presence was response enough. Heimdall's voice rang out one final time. The law is absolute, single combat to the death. Victory is decided only when one fighter falls. Let the battle begin. The horn sounded. The arena erupted in noise, gods cheering, humans shouting, the very air seeming to crack under the weight of attention focused on this single moment. Kratos watched his opponent. Calculated distance angle the way Verdict stood with absolute stillness. Then he moved forward, axe ready, and let the fight answer all remaining questions. The arena floor shifted beneath Kratos' feet. Not violently, the change was gradual. Deliberate like reality, remembering it had rules to enforce. The dark stone beneath his boots began to crystallize, frost spreading in geometric patterns that resembled scales of judgment rather than natural ice. The temperature dropped, but not in the way Norse winter bit at exposed skin. This cold was conceptual, pressing against the mind more than the body. It felt like standing before a verdict already written. Kratos adjusted his grip on the Leviathan axe. 30 paces ahead, Verdict remained motionless, his silver mask reflecting nothing, his robes moving in wind that didn't exist. The god hadn't drawn a weapon, hadn't shifted into a fighting stance. He simply stood, radiating the kind of certainty that came from believing the outcome was predetermined. The stands roared. Gods on their side, humans on theirs, but the noise was white static to Kratos. He'd learned decades ago to silence everything, except the opponent, the ground, and the space between where violence would happen. His breathing settled into the rhythm. He knew deep, controlled each exhale, releasing tension that served no purpose. Heimdall's voice cut through the chaos, amplified to overcome the crowd's fervor. Witness the stage of judgment. The Ragnarok field has activated, divine advantages stripped away. Only pure skill and will remain. He swept his arm toward Verdict. The god of judgment stands unopposed by mortal law. His decrees have shaped civilizations. His word has ended empires. The divine stands erupted in approval. Kratos caught fragments of their shouts proclaiming Verdict's infallibility. His perfect record, the inevitability of righteous law crushing rebellious chaos. He ignored them. Gods always talked too much before they died. Heimdall turned toward Kratos, and his theatrical demeanor sharpened into something that resembled genuine interest. And facing him, the ghost of Sparta mortal, born god-forged, self-made through blood and choice. He who slaughtered Olympus, he who broke the chains of fate itself. Can human will stand against cosmic decree? Will violence answer philosophy? The human stands remained quieter, but Kratos felt their attention like weight against his shoulders. They weren't cheering. They were hoping, praying maybe to whatever powers they still believed in. He didn't look toward them. Didn't search the crowd for Atreus. The boy would be watching. That was enough. The arena floor completed its transformation. Where there had been plain stone, now intricate patterns covered every inch, scales of justice rendered in frost and shadow, concentric circles radiating from the center point between the two fighters. Runes flared to life along the perimeter, forming walls of translucent energy that rose toward the fractured sky. Not to cage them in, Kratos realized. To ensure no outside interference. This fight would be decided by the two standing in the circle. Nothing else. Verdict spoke. His voice carried no echo, no resonance. Each word landed with the finality of a door closing. You represent disorder, the refusal to accept rightful hierarchy. I will restore balance. Kratos said nothing. Words were for people who needed to convince themselves they were right. He'd stopped needing that justification around the time he'd realized gods lied even when telling the truth. Your silence confirms guilt. Verdict raised one hand, and from his palm materialized a book. Not a weapon, but a tome bound in metal that gleamed like captured starlight. The pages inside were visible even from a distance, covered in script that writhed and reformed constantly. All transgressions are recorded. All debts must be answered. You have accumulated centuries of judgment. I will deliver it now. The book opened. Pages turned without wind, without touch, flipping through countless entries until stopping on something that made Verdict's mask tilt slightly, as if he were reading with satisfaction. Ares, god of war. Murdered by your hand. Athena, goddess of wisdom. Killed pursuing her agenda. Zeus, king of Olympus. Slain by the sun he created. The list continues. 47 divine deaths directly attributable to your actions. Kratos' jaw tightened. He knew the count, knew every name, every face, every moment of violence that had brought him to this point. Hearing them recited like inventory shouldn't have affected him. But memory was a weapon that cut both ways. Mortal casualties. Verdict turned another page. Countless, uncountable. Cities destroyed in your wars. Families erased by your collateral damage. You claim to fight for freedom, yet you have authored more suffering than most tyrants manage in lifetimes. The human stands grew quieter. Kratos could feel their doubt creeping in. Could sense the question forming. Was this their champion? A killer with a body count that made demons look restrained. He didn't blame them for wondering. He'd wondered the same thing every night for years. Verdict closed the book. It vanished from his hand as completely as it had appeared. By cosmic law, you are guilty. By divine decree, you are condemned. I am the instrument of correction. Your sentence is death. Heimdall stepped to the arena's edge, horn raised. The charges are spoken. The law invoked, let combat determine truth. Fight until one falls begin. The horn blast was still echoing when Verdict moved. His first step covered 15 feet. Not teleportation. Kratos' eyes tracked the motion, but speed that bent probability. The second step brought Verdict into striking range, and his hand swept forward in an arc that left trails of silver light. No weapon. Just the hand itself, backed by the weight of cosmic authority. Kratos brought the axe up edge, meeting palm, and the impact sent shockwaves rippling across the arena floor. The frost patterns cracked. His boots skidded backward 3 inches before finding purchase. Strength without muscle. Force derived from concept rather than sinew. The Ragnarok field had stripped divine advantages, but Verdict's power came from a different source. From the idea of law itself, given form and permission to enforce. The god pressed forward. His movements were economical, efficient, each strike carrying the certainty of judgment already passed. A palm strike toward Kratos' chest, a ridge hand toward his throat. Techniques that looked like martial arts, but felt like executions being carried out with bureaucratic precision. Kratos blocked, deflected, gave ground, and controlled steps. He was reading the patterns, learning the rhythm. Verdict fought like someone who'd never been denied. Every attack assumed success. Every motion contained the arrogance of inevitability. That was exploitable. That was where men found openings that gods never saw coming. A heel kick swept toward Kratos' knee. He twisted, let it pass within inches, and brought the axe around, in a horizontal slash aimed at Verdict's exposed ribs. The blade connected and stopped. not against armor or shield, but against something invisible that sparked silver where metal met resistance. A barrier. Or worse, a rule. Something declaring that the judge could not be judged, the arbiter could not be harmed by those he condemned. Verdict's counter came instantly. A straight punch to Kratos' solar plexus that doubled him over, drove air from his lungs, sent him staggering back 6 paces. The pain was clean sharp, exactly calibrated to demonstrate superiority without killing. A lesson being delivered with clinical detachment. The divine stands roared approval. Heimdall's voice soared above them. First blood to verdict. The law strikes true. Kratos straightened, forcing air back into his lungs. No blood yet, despite what Heimdall claimed. Just pain. Just information about what he was facing. He shifted his stance, lowering his center of gravity, and noticed the frost patterns on the floor beneath Verdict's feet. They were different now. Brighter. More complex. Like the arena itself was rewriting reality in the god's favor. You cannot harm me. Verdict's tone hadn't changed. Still flat. Still certain. I am judgment. To strike at judgment is to strike at order itself. The arena recognizes this truth. You fight an opponent the universe itself protects. Kratos spat to the side, clearing his mouth. Tasted copper. Internal bleeding, probably. Minor. Manageable. He met Verdict's masked gaze and felt something cold settle in his chest. The thing he'd felt before every impossible fight. Before every opponent who'd claimed invincibility. Before every god who'd assured him resistance was futile. It was the feeling of deciding that impossibility didn't matter. He attacked. Not with the axe this time. He closed the distance in 3 explosive strides and drove his shoulder into Verdict's center mass, committing his full weight to the tackle. The impact drove them both backward, and for a half-second Kratos felt the god's balance break. Felt the certainty crack just enough to let doubt creep in. They hit the ground together. Kratos rolled with the momentum, came up first, and brought the axe down in an overhead chop aimed at Verdict's mask. The blade descended and stopped again. Same invisible resistance. Same silver spark. But closer this time. The barrier flickered for a fraction of a second, like a torch struggling against wind. Verdict swept Kratos' legs out from under him with a kick that came from a prone position. Impossible leverage turned possible through sheer assertion of authority. Kratos hit the ground, hard-rolled and pushed back to his feet as Verdict rose with the same mechanical precision. You persist. The god sounded neither impressed nor annoyed, simply stating fact. This is the flaw in your design. You do not recognize when continuation serves no purpose. I recognize necessity. Kratos circled right, forcing Verdict to turn to adjust. That's more than you'll ever understand. Necessity is what I define. Verdict mirrored his movement, maintaining the same precise distance. You define only stubbornness. They clashed again. Axe against palm, boot against knee, elbow against mask. The exchanges were faster now, both fighters settling into the language of violence that transcended words. Kratos gave ground when giving bought him information. Pressed forward when he saw openings that might not exist, but demanded testing anyway. Each collision taught him something: how far the barrier extended, how much force it took to make it flicker, whether sustained pressure broke it down or strengthened it. The barrier was consistent, unbreakable, but not perfect. It protected Verdict from direct harm, but it couldn't protect him from displacement. Couldn't stop Kratos from forcing him to move, to react, to acknowledge that the universe's protection didn't prevent being pushed around. That was the crack. That was where the impossibility became possible. Verdict seemed to recognize the shift. His attacks changed, became more aggressive. Less about demonstrating superiority, more about ending the fight before Kratos found whatever weakness existed in cosmic law. A palm strike cracked against Kratos' jaw. A knee found his ribs. An elbow slammed into his temple hard enough to blur his vision. Kratos took the hits, cataloged the pain, stayed standing. This was familiar territory, absorbing punishment while searching for the single moment when defense turned to offense. He'd done this against gods, bigger, faster, more creative in their brutality. Verdict was strong. Verdict was protected. But Verdict was also predictable in the way true believers always were. They fought across the arena floor, boots breaking frost, bodies turning the geometric patterns into chaos. The stands were screaming now, divine and mortal, both the noise reaching levels that made rational thought difficult. Kratos pushed it away. Let it become background static. Focused on the opponent, the space, the rhythm of exchange. Verdict's book materialized again, hovering in the air beside him. Pages turned while he fought, reading entries aloud in that same emotionless tone. Calliope, your daughter, dead by your hand, albeit indirect. Lysandra, your wife, burned alive in the temple you raised. These deaths were not combat. They were failure. They were weakness disguised as rage. The words hit harder than the strikes. Kratos felt them land in places the Ragnarok field couldn't protect. Old wounds that never fully healed, just scabbed over enough to function around. His daughter's face, his wife's screams. The moment he'd become the monster, every god afterward assumed he'd always been. His counterattack came half a second slow. Verdict's palm caught him across the face, sent him sprawling, left him tasting blood for real this time. The divine stands erupted. Heimdall's narration painted the moment as triumph of law over chaos, order over rebellion. Kratos pushed himself upright. Blood ran from his split lip. His vision swam briefly before focusing. Across the arena, Verdict stood with the book still floating beside him, pages settling on a new entry. You claim to fight for your son. The god's voice carried across the sudden quiet that had fallen over the crowd. To protect him from the judgment you believe unjust. But what protection can you offer? When you are the greatest threat he faces, when your history of violence follows him like a shadow, when every enemy you've made will eventually find him. Kratos' hands tightened on the axe. In the stands, somewhere among the human section, Atreus was watching, hearing this. Learning exactly what kind of man his father had been would always be underneath whatever restraint he pretended to have learned. The boy already knew some of it, but hearing it proclaimed in an arena used as evidence of unworthiness turned knowledge into weapon. Verdict took a step forward. You cannot win this fight. The law is absolute. Your sentence was written before you entered this circle. All that remains is execution. The frost beneath Kratos' feet began to glow. Runes activated chains of silver light rising from the floor to wrap around his ankles, his wrists pulling him down toward kneeling position. Not physical chains, he could break those. These were bindings of concept, of cosmic law asserting itself, of the universe being told he was guilty and reality adjusting to enforce the verdict. The divine stands were chanting now. A single word repeated in dozen languages. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Kratos fought the chains, pulled against them with everything the Ragnarok field left him muscle-earned through training while forged in suffering the fundamental refusal to kneel that had defined him since childhood. The chains tightened. His knees buckled. The frost crept higher up his legs, locking joints, freezing motion. Verdict approached slowly, deliberately. The book turned to its final page. Your sentence is death. The method is irrelevant. The outcome is certain. Do you have final words? Kratos looked up through the chains, through the pain, through the weight of everything true and horrible that had been used against him. He saw Verdict's mask, saw his own reflection in its silver surface, bloodied, bound, failing. Behind that reflection, somewhere in the stands, his son was watching. The boy deserved better than a father who died on his knees. Kratos' voice came out rough, scraped raw, but carrying more weight than any of Heimdall's pronouncements. No. The chains pulled tighter. Verdict raised his hand for the killing strike. And in that moment, Kratos made his choice. Not to accept, not to surrender, but to acknowledge what he'd spent the entire fight avoiding. That this battle wasn't about proving he could win on cosmic law's terms. It was about proving law itself could be challenged when it served tyranny. That the universe's rules weren't absolute when they protected the guilty from consequence. He stopped fighting the chains, stopped pulling against them. Instead, he let them pull him down and used the momentum. Dropped to one knee deliberately, not in submission, but in preparation. Gathered his strength, felt the axe in his hand, the Volunder binding that made it an extension of will rather than mere metal. Verdict's strike descended, palm aimed at Kratos' skull, enough force to cave bone to end the fight, to deliver the sentenced death. Kratos moved. Not away, toward. He surged up from his kneeling position, driving through the chains that shattered like ice under pressure. They weren't designed to contain. The axe came with him in an upward arc that carried every ounce of defiance he'd learned from a lifetime of refusing impossible odds. The blade met Verdict's descending palm, met the barrier that had turned aside every previous strike. But this time, Kratos wasn't trying to break through divine protection. He was trying to redirect it, to use the god's own momentum, his own certainty against him. The barrier held. The palm didn't penetrate. But the force of two opposing absolutes meeting in the same space had to go somewhere. The arena floor exploded beneath them, frost and stone fragmenting outward in a shockwave that rattled the stands and sent cracked spider webbing across the perfect geometric patterns. Both fighters were thrown backward. Kratos hit the ground rolling, came up in a crouch. Verdict landed on his feet, but his mask had cracked. A single line running from forehead to chin, splitting the silver into imperfect halves. The divine stands fell silent. Heimdall's voice returned, but quieter now, uncertain for the first time. The challenger remains standing. The judgment continues. Kratos straightened. Blood ran from a dozen small cuts. His ribs ached. His vision still swam at the edges, but he was standing. The chains were broken. And across the arena, Verdict's mask was cracked. Impossible, maybe, but happening anyway. Verdict touched his mask fingers, tracing the crack. When he spoke, his voice held something it hadn't before. Not quite emotion, not quite doubt, but recognition. You should be dead. I've heard that before. Kratos rolled his shoulders, settling into stance again. The axe felt lighter now, or maybe he'd just stopped caring about the weight. The people who said it didn't survive to repeat themselves. For the first time since the fight began, Verdict moved without certainty. His next attack came a fraction slower, testing, rather than proclaiming. Kratos met it head-on, and the arena shook with the impact of two forces that had both decided the other had to break. The fight was only beginning. The real fight. The one where impossibility stopped being an excuse and started being a challenge. Kratos smiled. It wasn't pleasant, wasn't kind, but it was honest. He'd missed this. The crack in Verdict's mask spread. Not quickly, the fracture moved with glacial patience, millimeter by millimeter, like ice remembering it could break. Kratos watched it widen as he circled right, keeping his weight distributed, his breathing measured, despite the fire in his ribs. The god across from him had stopped moving with that mechanical certainty. Now he adjusted his stance incrementally, compensating for something. Doubt, maybe. Or the first recognition that the outcome he'd declared inevitable might require actual effort to achieve. The arena floor beneath them was ruined. The perfect geometric frost patterns had shattered into chaos, leaving irregular patches of dark stone showing through like wounds in skin. The runes along the perimeter still glowed, but their light flickered steady rhythm, broken by whatever collision had cracked both the mask and the illusion of absolute law. Heimdall's voice filled the momentary stillness, riding the crowd's uncertain murmur, the impossible made manifest. The challenger has damaged the judge. Can cosmic law bleed? Can certainty crack? Witness. The divine stands weren't cheering anymore. Kratos caught fragments of their confusion gods questioning whether the barrier had failed, whether Verdict had allowed the strike through as some kind of test, whether the crack meant anything at all. They needed explanations, needed the universe to make sense according to rules they'd written. The possibility that their rules were negotiable terrified them more than any physical threat. Good. Fear was leverage. Kratos had learned that truth before he'd learned to walk. Verdict touched the crack in his mask again, fingers tracing its path with something approaching fascination. When he spoke, his voice carried a new edge. Not emotion, not quite, but acknowledgement. You broke cosmic protection. That shouldn't exist with impossible outcomes. Then your possibilities need expansion. Kratos shifted his grip on the axe, feeling the Volunder binding hum against his palm. The weapon wanted to move, wanted to cut. He held it still, waiting for the right moment. Patience was harder than violence, but more effective when used correctly. I will correct this error. Verdict's hand dropped from his mask. The book materialized beside him again, pages flipping faster than before, searching for something. There must be precedent. There must be law governing how the ungovernable is contained. You won't find it in there. Kratos took a step forward, testing. Verdict's eyes, visible now through the mask's crack, tracked the movement. Your book catalogs what already happened. I make new history. The pages stopped turning, settled on an entry that made Verdict's posture shift into something aggressive. Precedent found. You have broken cosmic law before. The sisters of fate. The threads of destiny. You severed causality itself to pursue revenge. The method is recorded. Kratos' jaw tightened. He remembered the sisters. Remembered the loom of fate, that chamber where past and future wove together, where the universe's inevitability took physical form. He'd killed them, all three. Had cut the threads that declared his daughter's death necessary, his suffering predetermined his future written in tragedies he couldn't prevent. It hadn't brought her back, hadn't undone anything, but it had proven the universe could be made to bleed when it claimed to be untouchable. That act created instability. Verdict's voice gained intensity, still no emotion, but urgency now, like a scholar discovering a critical flaw in a theorem. You damaged causality, weakened the barrier between what is and what could be. That damage persists. It's why you can harm me now. You're an infection in reality's structure. The human stands erupted in confused noise. Half of them heard infection and recoiled. The other half heard he damaged fate itself and leaned forward with something between hope and disbelief. Kratos ignored both reactions, focused on verdict on the way the god was recalibrating, adjusting his understanding to account for an opponent who'd already proven rules were breakable. If you're an infection, verdict continued, then I am the cure. Cosmic law must be restored. Your existence must be corrected. He raised both hands, and the frost patterns on the floor responded. They didn't reform into geometry. They grew wild, chaotic, spreading like crystalline cancer across every surface. The temperature plummeted. Kratos' breath came out in clouds. The frost reached his boots and climbed. Not binding him like the chains had, this was different. Slower, more invasive. It crept up his legs like arthritis made visible, trying to lock his joints, freeze. His muscles turn his body into a statue of its own, failure to move. Kratos slammed the axe down. The blade bit through frost and stone, and where it struck ice shattered in a radius of 3 feet. The cold retreated momentarily, giving him space to move. He pulled the axe free and struck again, clearing another patch. The frost kept growing back, but slower where he'd broken it. Like the arena itself was learning to fear the weapon. You delay inevitable conclusion. Verdict walked forward through the frost, as if it didn't exist. For him, it probably didn't. The arena was enforcing his judgment, turning the entire battlefield into a courtroom where he held absolute authority. Every moment you resist adds to your sentence. Surrender would be merciful. Mercy from you. Kratos broke through another surge of frost, his movements becoming more aggressive. I've seen your mercy. It looks like chains and pronouncements. I'll take my chances with resistance. They clashed again. Axe met palm, but this time the barrier flickered visibly, that silver spark dimming for half a heartbeat before reasserting itself. Kratos saw it, filed the information away. The crack in the mask wasn't cosmetic. It was structural. Whatever protected verdict from harm was compromised, healing slower than it broke. That meant sustained pressure. That meant not giving the god time to recover between exchanges. Kratos pressed forward. Not wild swings, controlled strikes aimed at testing the barrier's limits. A horizontal slash that forced Verdict to block with his forearm. A vertical chop that made him sidestep. A thrust that he deflected with an open palm. Each impact made the barrier flicker. Each flicker lasted microseconds longer than the last. Verdict adapted. His counterattacks came faster, targeting joints and nerve clusters with precision that suggested he'd studied anatomy at a level beyond mortal understanding. A strike to Kratos' elbow joint that made his grip on the axe momentarily weaken. A kick to the outside of his knee that compromised his stance. A palm thrust to his solar plexus that drove air from his lungs and sent him stumbling backward 3 steps. The frost surged up during that stumble, locked around Kratos' right leg, froze it in place. He swung the axe down to break free, but Verdict was already moving. A flying knee caught Kratos across the jaw, snapped his head sideways, sent blood spattering across pristine ice. The impact rang in his skull like a bell. You're slowing. Verdict landed in a crouch, then rose smoothly. The cold affects you. The damage accumulates. Your body has limits. I do not. Kratos spat blood onto the frost. It steamed where it landed, melting tiny holes through cosmic law made physical. Bodies break. That's not the same as stopping. He wrenched his leg free, ice shattering around the joint, and launched himself forward. Closed the distance before Verdict could reset his defense. The axe came in low, aimed at the god's legs, not to cut through the barrier, but to sweep them out from under him. Contact sent both fighters sprawling. They hit the ground hard. Kratos rolled, came up faster, drove his boot down toward Verdict's chest. The stomp connected with the barrier instead of flesh, but the impact still cratered the frost beneath the god's body. Still forced acknowledgement that weight and momentum didn't care about cosmic protection. Verdict swept Kratos' supporting leg. He went down, turned the fall into a shoulder roll, came up with the axe already swinging. The blade whistled past Verdict's head, deliberately high, forcing him to duck to break eye contact to lose a second of awareness. In that second, Kratos drew the blades of chaos. The chains rattled as they unfurled from his forearms, the blades igniting with fire that the Ragnarok field should have suppressed, but didn't. The Volundr had worked on these two, bound them to something deeper than divine blessing. They burned because Kratos willed them to burn, because rage, even controlled rage, was part of his fundamental structure. He whipped the blades forward in crossing arcs. Verdict brought his hands up to block barrier flaring bright, and the chains wrapped around his arms. Not cutting, binding. Kratos pulled hard, yanking the god off balance, then released one blade and swung it in a tight circle that built momentum before releasing toward Verdict's head. The blade struck the barrier, didn't penetrate. But the fire spread across the invisible surface, revealing its shape, a dome surrounding Verdict's body, flickering under sustained flame. Kratos saw the structure, saw where it was weakest, where the crack in the mask corresponded to fractures in the protection. Upper left quadrant, just below the collarbone. He filed that information away and pulled both blades back before Verdict could grab the chains. The god lunged forward, hands grasping, trying to seize the weapons and neutralize them. Kratos gave ground, let the chains extend to their full length, used the distance to his advantage. New weapons. Verdict's voice had lost more of that flat certainty. Now it carried something approaching calculation. You adapt. You improvise. These are survival mechanisms, not indicators of victory. Survival is the first step. Kratos whipped the blades in figure-8 patterns, keeping Verdict at range, forcing him to either close distance through the fire or maintain separation. Victory is what comes after you've survived long enough to find the opening. The divine stands were shouting now, some demanding Verdict end this quickly, others arguing about whether the blades of chaos violated the Volundr agreement. Kratos heard Brunhilde's voice cutting through the noise, cold and precise, explaining that the Volundr had legitimized all of Kratos' weapons, that changing armaments mid-fight was legal under tournament law. The argument continued above him. He ignored it, focused on Verdict on the way the god was circling left, trying to get outside the blade's effective range. The frost surged up again, thicker this time, trying to lock Kratos in place while Verdict repositioned. Kratos drove both blades into the ground. The fire spread outward in a wave, melting frost faster than it could reform, creating a circle of clear stone around him. He pulled the blades free and immediately had to defend against Verdict's rushing attack. They traded blows at close range, too close for the blades to be effective. Kratos blocked with the chains themselves, using the links like shields, redirecting strikes that carried enough force to shatter bone. Verdict's knee found his ribs again. His elbow cracked against Kratos' temple. His palm, strike to the throat, was deflected at the last second, catching shoulder instead, but still driving Kratos backward. The god was faster in close quarters, more technically skilled. Every strike was placed with surgical precision, targeting vulnerabilities, exploiting openings that appeared for fractions of seconds. Kratos gave ground, because staying in that range meant accumulating damage he couldn't afford. He broke contact, put 10 feet between them, and switched back to the axe. The Leviathan axe felt right in his hands, balanced, familiar, an extension of will that required no thought to wield effectively. He threw it. The weapon spun through the air, trailing frost of its own blue and cold and carrying momentum backed by decades of practice. Verdict dodged left, predictable, necessary, and Kratos recalled the axe. It reversed course mid-flight, drawn back to his hand by the same Volunder binding that made it more than metal. The return trajectory clipped Verdict's shoulder. Didn't penetrate the barrier, but the impact spun him partially around, broke his stance. Created the opening Kratos needed. He was already moving. Crossed the distance in 4 strides, axe materializing back into his grip, and brought it down in an overhead chop aimed at that weak point he'd identified. Upper left quadrant, just below the collarbone. The blade struck the barrier. The barrier held, but the crack in Verdict's mask extended. Split down past the chin, now exposing more of the face beneath. The god staggered backward, one hand going to his mask, the other raised defensively. Enough! Verdict's voice came harder now, sharper, the flat affect cracking along with everything else. I tire of this demonstration. Your persistence proves nothing except inability to recognize defeat. His book manifested again, but different this time. Larger. The pages no longer turned, they simply opened all of them at once, creating a fan of paper that spread around Verdict like wings. Each page glowed with script that writhed and reformed, and as Kratos watched, images began to appear on the surfaces. Not text. Memories. He saw Sparta. Saw himself younger, harder, leading armies into battles he'd convinced himself were glorious. Saw the village that had begged for mercy, the children who'd tried to hide the orders he'd carried out because Ares had commanded, and Spartan warriors didn't question their war god. He saw Calliope. Not as she'd died worse, as she'd lived. Playing in the garden of their home while he'd been away, conquering territories he couldn't even name now. Building trust with a father who'd chosen violence over presence, who'd convinced himself that strength would protect her better than simply being there. He saw Lysandra, saw the moment she'd recognized him through the blood rage, through the curse Ares had inflicted. Saw her eyes not afraid of death, but heartbroken that this was who he'd become. That the man she'd loved had been consumed so completely by what he'd thought he needed to be. The images multiplied, spread across every page. Every moment of failure, every choice that had led to suffering, every time he'd convinced himself the ends justified the means. The weight of them pressed against his mind like physical force. This is truth. Verdict's voice came from behind the wall of memories. This is the evidence of your unworthiness. You cannot fight what you cannot deny. Kratos stood in the center of the arena, surrounded by his own history-given form. The human stands had gone quiet. Even the gods had stopped shouting. Everyone was watching to see if the ghost of Sparta would break under the weight of what he'd been. His hands tightened on the axe. The memories weren't lies. That was the problem. They were accurate. Perfect recalls of moments he'd spent years trying to bury, under the justification that he'd changed, that Norse Kratos was different from the monster who'd burned Olympus. But standing here, seeing it all laid out like evidence in a trial, he couldn't escape the truth. He was different. But he was also still that man. Still carried every death, every failure, every moment of choosing violence because it was easier than choosing anything else. The memories didn't define him, but they were part of him. Denying that would be another lie. I don't deny it. His voice came out rough, scraped raw by the admission. I did all of it. Became all of it. That's not the question. The memories flickered. Verdict's silhouette shifted behind them. Then what is the question? Whether what I've done makes what I'm doing now impossible. Kratos took a step forward toward the wall of his own failures. Whether the past erases the right to fight for something better. The past is evidence of pattern, of nature, of what you will always be when pressure is applied. Verdict's voice grew louder. You claim to fight for your son, to protect him, but you are the danger. You are the threat he needs protection from. Your history proves it. In the stands, Atreus was watching. Kratos felt it like weight against his spine. The boy was hearing this, learning exactly what kind of man had raised him, what blood ran through his veins, what legacy he'd inherited alongside Loki's gifts. The truth would hurt him, was probably hurting him right now. But the truth was also necessary. Better Atreus learned it here in context than discovering it later from enemies who'd use it as weapon without explanation. My son knows what I was. Kratos took another step. The memories swirled around him, Calliope's face, Lysandra's heartbreak, the burning temples and broken bodies. I told him, didn't hide it, didn't pretend the past was anything other than what it was. And yet, you claim to protect him. The pages rustled, images shifting. How? By teaching him violence, by showing him that strength solves problems. You're creating another version of yourself, another killer who'll justify everything with necessity. No. Kratos stopped walking, stood in the center of the memory storm, and felt every image press against him. I'm teaching him that strength is a tool, that it serves the person who wields it, that he gets to choose what kind of man he becomes, regardless of what his father was. The memories compressed, tightened around him like a cage. Kratos felt the pressure building, felt Verdict trying to crush him under the weight of accumulated guilt and failure. Felt the arena itself responding to cosmic law's demand that the guilty submit to judgment. He didn't submit. Didn't fight the memories either. Just stood in them. Let them exist. Acknowledged every face, every moment, every choice that had brought him to this arena. The weight was enormous. The guilt was real. But neither one meant he had to stop. Your son watches you now. Verdict's voice came from everywhere, the pages amplifying it. He sees you bleeding, sees you struggling, sees that even his father, the man who killed gods, can be brought low by truth. What does that teach him? Kratos looked up toward the human stands, couldn't see Atreus through the swirling memories, but knew where the boy would be. Knew he was probably terrified, probably questioning whether his father was strong enough to win this. Good. Let him question. Let him see that strength wasn't about never struggling. It was about struggling and standing up anyway. It teaches him, Kratos said, voice carrying across the arena, that the past doesn't control the present unless you let it. That guilt is real, but so is choice. That you can be a killer and still decide not to kill, can be a monster and still choose something better. The memories shattered. Not because Verdict released them, because Kratos pushed through. Didn't deny them, didn't fight them, just refused to be paralyzed by them. The pages exploded outward in fragments of light and shadow, dissolving into nothing as the truth they'd been weaponized to deliver lost its power to immobilize. Verdict stood exposed in the center of the destruction. His mask was barely intact now, more cracked than whole pieces falling away to reveal the face beneath. Not monstrous, just cold, just certain. Just a being who'd convinced himself he was right, and therefore anyone who disagreed was wrong. Kratos had killed a dozen gods who'd worn that same expression. Impossible. Verdict's voice finally cracked along with everything else. You should be broken. The weight should be unbearable. It is unbearable. Kratos rolled his shoulders, feeling where the memories had pressed against him, where they'd left marks that would never fully heal. I bear it anyway. That's what necessity means. He raised the axe. Verdict raised his hands. The barrier flickered between them, still there, still protecting, but weaker now. Compromised. Breakable. The real fight was about to begin. The one where cosmic law learned what happened when it tried to stop someone who'd already decided the outcome was negotiable. Kratos stepped forward, and the arena held its breath. The silence after the memories shattered lasted 3 heartbeats. Then Verdict screamed. Not in pain, gods rarely felt physical suffering the way mortals did, but in fury. In the rage of absolute certainty meeting contradiction, it couldn't dismiss. His voice tore through the arena like metal grinding against stone, raw and jagged, and utterly human in its loss of control. You should be broken. The words came out shredded, all pretense of mechanical calm abandoned. The weight of your sins should crush you. The guilt should paralyze you. Why do you still stand? Kratos didn't answer. Let the silence speak for him. Let his continued existence in defiance of cosmic law's decree serve as response enough. The divine stands erupted in chaos. Some gods were shouting for Verdict to finish this, to reassert dominance, to prove that law still held authority. Others argued among themselves about whether the memory attack had been legal, whether using a fighter's trauma against them violated some unspoken code. Odin watched with his single eye, gleaming expression, unreadable. Thor leaned forward, knuckles white against his throne's armrest. Heimdall's voice cut through the noise, strained, but maintaining that theatrical quality. The judge falters, the ghost endures. This battle has transcended mere combat. It has become a trial of philosophies. Can will overcome decree? Can choice defy destiny? Kratos adjusted his grip on the axe. Blood ran from a dozen cuts across his arms and face. His ribs ached where Verdict's strikes had landed. His left knee threatened to buckle if he put full weight on it. The damage was accumulating. The Ragnarok field ensured he felt every injury as acutely as any mortal would. But pain was just information. And the information told him he could still fight. Verdict's remaining mask fragments fell away completely, revealing the face beneath. It was angular, perfect in its symmetry, carved from marble white skin that had never known sun or scar. The eyes were the worst part silver, without iris or pupil, reflecting everything but revealing nothing. A face designed to be impartial, inhuman in its commitment to objectivity. If truth will not break you, Verdict said voice, regaining some measure of control, then consequence will. The book appeared again, but transformed. The pages were no longer white, they'd turned crimson, as if soaked in blood. The text on them writhed faster, more aggressive, forming words that Kratos could almost read from across the arena. Verdict raised one hand toward the human stands toward the section where Atreus watched. Your son, the god's voice carried across the sudden hush. Loki, Atreus. The boy caught between identities, between worlds, between the man who raised him and the prophecies that claim him. He sits there watching you bleed, wondering if his father is strong enough, wondering if the ghost of Sparta is just a title you wear rather than power you possess. Kratos' hands tightened on the axe handle. He didn't look toward the stands. didn't give Verdict the satisfaction of seeing him react. But every nerve in his body screamed at him to turn to check that Atreus was safe, that this wasn't a feint before some attack aimed at the boy. "He's protected by the rules," Verdict continued. "The stands are neutral ground. I cannot harm him directly, but I can deliver judgment upon him. I can declare his fate and let cosmic law enforce what I decree. You threaten him, you die." Kratos' voice came out flat, empty of anything except promise. "Not eventually. Not after I've bled more, right now. I will kill you right now. You cannot kill judgment." Verdict's silver eyes fixed on Kratos. "But you can choose what judgment falls, on you or on him." The crimson pages spread wide. Text flared into visibility, and Heimdall, compelled by some aspect of the arena's magic, or simply unable to resist narrating, began reading aloud what appeared there. "Atreus, son of Kratos, inheritor of divine blood from multiple pantheons. Guilty of deception. Guilty of transformation without consent. Guilty of embracing powers meant to remain dormant. The sentence for such transgressions is no." Kratos' shout cut through Heimdall's recitation. The word carried enough force to make the MC actually stop mid-sentence, the Yallarhorn nearly slipping from his grasp. Verdict tilted his head slightly, that inhuman face showing something that might have been satisfaction. "You reject the judgment, then accept it yourself. Kneel. Acknowledge your guilt. Surrender your right to fight. If you do this, I will spare your son the consequences of his bloodline." The human stands erupted in protests. Brunhilde's voice rose above them, sharp and cutting. "That violates tournament law. You cannot force surrender through hostages. The stands are protected. I force nothing." Verdict's response was calm, again settled back into that terrible certainty. "I offer choice. The father may accept judgment in the son's place. That is mercy, not coercion." Kratos stood motionless. His mind raced through possibilities, tactics, ways to turn this around. But every path led back to the same truth. Verdict couldn't actually harm Atreus. The stands were protected. Tournament law was absolute on that point. This was a bluff, a psychological attack dressed up as genuine threat. But what if it wasn't? What if cosmic law really could reach past the protections? What if Verdict's authority extended to declaring fates that reality itself would enforce consequences that materialized not through direct action, but through the universe? Bending to accommodate divine decree, Kratos had seen stranger things, had witnessed gods reshape reality through nothing but will and word, had watched Zeus kill with lightning that came from nowhere, Poseidon drown cities with oceans that hadn't existed seconds before. Divine authority wasn't bound by mortal logic. He looked up toward the human stands, found Atreus in the crowd. The boy was standing now, hands gripping the railing in front of him, face pale but jaw set with determination. Their eyes met across the distance. Atreus shook his head once. A clear message, don't you dare. The boy had courage, had grown into someone who wouldn't accept protection bought through his father's surrender. That should have made Kratos proud. Instead, it made the choice harder. Time runs out. Verdict raised his hand higher, and the crimson pages began to glow. Choose. Your pride or his safety. Your fight or his future. Choose now, or I choose for you. Kratos' breathing slowed, deepened. He felt the familiar coldness settle over him, the space in his mind where emotion became irrelevant and only outcome mattered. He'd been in this position before. Different circumstances, different threats, but the same fundamental equation: sacrifice himself or watch someone he loved suffer. Every time before, he'd found a third option. Some way to refuse the binary choice, to fight through the dilemma rather than surrender to it. Sometimes it had worked. Sometimes it had only delayed the inevitable. But he'd always tried. Because accepting imposed choices was the same as accepting chains, and he'd sworn he'd never be bound again. No. His voice came out quiet, certain. I don't kneel. Not to you. Not to save anyone. Because if I kneel now, I teach him that threats work. That power decides truth. That he should surrender when the fight gets hard. Verdict's hand clenched. The pages flared brighter. Then he bears the consequence of your pride. He bears the truth. Kratos stepped forward, axe rising. That his father fought when fighting was necessary. That he didn't trade freedom for false safety. That some things are worth the risk. The light from the pages intensified, building toward release. Kratos knew he had seconds before whatever verdict was preparing launched. Knew the god expected him to panic, to rush forward recklessly, to make a desperate play that would leave him open. He did the opposite. Stopped moving. Lowered the axe slightly. Let his posture shift from aggressive to neutral. Became still in the way mountains were still not passive but unmovable. You won't hurt him. Kratos' words came out measured, each one placed with precision. You can't. Not because you lack power, but because you lack certainty. You declare yourself absolute, but you're standing here bleeding from a cracked mask. Your barrier failing, your predictions proven wrong. If you were truly law incarnate, I'd be dead already. The light flickered. Just a fraction. Just enough to prove the point. You're bluffing. Kratos took another step forward. Using my fear against me because your strength isn't enough. And that means I've already won the part of this fight that matters. Verdict's hand trembled. The page's light began to dim. You gamble with your son's life. I trust tournament law. Kratos' voice hardened. And I trust that if you could actually hurt him, you would have done it already instead of wasting time with threats. For 3 seconds, nothing moved. The entire arena held its breath, waiting to see if Kratos had calculated correctly, if his read of cosmic law's limits was accurate or catastrophically wrong. Then Verdict lowered his hand. The crimson pages dissolved. The god's silver eyes fixed on Kratos with something that looked almost like respect. You see clearly. The admission came grudgingly. The boy is protected. I cannot touch him, but I can touch you. Verdict moved. Faster than before, desperation lending speed to certainty. He closed the distance in 2 steps and drove his palm toward Kratos' chest. Not trying to strike through the barrier this time, just using raw force to overwhelm, to prove that even without cosmic protection, a god's strength exceeded mortal limits. The impact sent Kratos flying backward. He hit the ground hard, rolled, came up coughing blood. His sternum ached, cracked probably from the force of that single strike. The Ragnarok field had reduced Verdict to mortal-adjacent power levels, but a god's mortal-adjacent was still beyond what most humans could survive. Kratos pushed himself upright, spat blood onto the frost, raised the axe again. Verdict was already moving. A knee to the ribs, an elbow to the jaw, a heel kick that swept Kratos' legs and sent him crashing down again. The god was abandoning technique, just overwhelming him with raw aggression, with the frustrated fury of absolute authority being questioned. Each hit landed harder than the last. Kratos blocked what he could, but the damage accumulated. His vision blurred. His left arm went partially numb from a strike to the nerve cluster. His breathing came ragged, each inhale shooting pain through his damaged ribs. He'd been hurt worse, had survived injuries that should have killed him a dozen times over. But those had been before the Ragnarok field. Before divine advantages were stripped away. Now he was fighting with human limitations, and those limitations were screaming at him to stay down. He stood up anyway. Verdict hit him again, sent him sprawling across the arena floor, blood trailing behind him. The divine stands were cheering now, convinced they were watching law reassert itself, watching rebellion crushed under the weight of cosmic authority. Kratos rose again, slower this time, using the axe as a crutch to push himself vertical. His legs shook, his vision swam, but he was standing. "Stay down!" Verdict's voice cracked with genuine incomprehension. "You've lost, accept the judgment." Not finished. Kratos' words came out slurred through split lips and loosened teeth. Not dead. He lunged, not at Verdict, at the ground between them. Drove the axe down with everything he had left, and the frost there shattered in an explosion of ice and stone. The shockwave knocked them both backward, created a crater 3 feet deep right in the arena's center. Kratos fell into it, landed hard on his back, staring up at the fractured sky above. Every part of him hurt. His body was demanding he stop insisting that he'd taken all the punishment flesh could handle. But he'd learned decades ago that the body's demands were negotiable. That pain was just sensation. That damage mattered less than will. He rolled onto his side, saw Verdict climbing out of the crater on the opposite side, the god's perfect face finally showing cracks of its own, not physical, but in the certainty that had defined him. Saw the barrier around him flickering constantly, now barely holding cosmic protection, eroded by sustained assault and the weight of being proven wrong. And Kratos saw the weak point again. Upper left quadrant, just below the collarbone, where the barrier flickered longest, where the crack in the mask had started, where cosmic law's protection was thinnest. One strike, placed perfectly, would be enough. He just had to get there, had to stand, had to move, had to do all the things his body was screaming at him were impossible. In the stands, Atreus was shouting something. Kratos couldn't hear it over the roar of the crowd, over the ringing in his ears, over the sound of his own labored breathing. But he could see the boy's face. See the fear there, the desperate hope, the unwillingness to look away, even as his father bled across cosmic judgment's floor. That was enough. That was the fuel that mattered more than pain, more than damage, more than the rational calculation that he'd taken too much punishment to continue. Kratos planted the axe, used it to lever himself upright. His legs nearly gave out, but he locked his knees through sheer will. Took one step, then another. Started walking toward Verdict with the inexorable patience of winter. Impossible. Verdict backed away for the first time in the fight. "You should be unconscious. Should be dying. The damage is too severe." "Probably." Kratos kept walking. Each step sent agony through his broken ribs, his damaged joints, his countless injuries. "But I've been dying since I was a child. Haven't finished yet." He reached the crater's edge. Verdict stood on the other side, 15 feet away, hands raised defensively. The god was genuinely afraid now. Kratos could see it in the way his stance had shifted, in the way his silver eyes tracked every movement with desperate calculation. Fear was leverage. Fear meant the outcome was no longer certain. Fear meant verdict had finally recognized what he was facing. Not a warrior defined by power, but a warrior defined by refusal to stop. I offer terms. Verdict's voice came fast, urgent. Surrender now, accept judgment, and I will declare it served. You lose the fight, but you live. Your son remains protected. You've proven your point that will can challenge law. That's enough. Don't throw away your life for pride. Kratos stopped at the crater's edge, considered the offer. It was genuine, he could hear it in Verdict's tone. The god wanted out, wanted to avoid whatever came next, was offering mercy disguised as pragmatism. It was almost tempting. He was hurt, badly. Continuing this fight risked permanent damage, risked pushing his body past the point where will could compensate for injury. And he'd proven his point, had shown that cosmic law could be challenged, that the universe's rules weren't absolute. But winning the philosophical argument wasn't the same as winning the fight. And if he surrendered now, the council would claim it proved humanity needed divine oversight after all. That even the strongest mortal would eventually submit to cosmic authority when properly motivated. Atreus would watch his father give up, would learn that there was a point where you stopped fighting a threshold of pain, where surrender became acceptable. Kratos couldn't teach that lesson. Not when the boy's entire future would be defined by how he handled impossible situations. This is by whether he believed problems could be overcome or merely endured. No. Kratos started walking again. Slowly, deliberately. We finish this. Verdict's hands dropped slightly. The fear in his silver eyes crystallized into something else. Resignation, maybe. Or the calm of someone who'd run out of alternatives and was defaulting back to what they knew best. Then I will kill you, the god's voice steadied. Not through judgment, through force. If you insist on fighting until death, I will deliver it. Good. Kratos raised the axe. Finally honest. They charged simultaneously, met in the center of the crater with a collision that sent cracks spiderwebbing through the stone beneath their feet. Axe met palm. Barrier sparked and held. But barely. The protection was fragmentary now, covering Verdict in patches rather than a complete shell. Kratos drove forward, slammed his shoulder into Verdict's chest, broke the god's stance, followed with an upward slash that the god barely dodged. The barrier flickered across his torso, and Kratos saw it. The weak point was exposed. Just for a moment, just long enough. He couldn't reach it with the axe. The angle was wrong, the distance too far. His damaged body too slow to capitalize on the opening before it closed. But he had other weapons. Kratos released the axe, let it fall, drew the blades of chaos in a motion so practiced it felt like breathing. The chains rattled as they extended, the blades igniting with fire that reflected in Verdict's widening eyes. He whipped both blades forward in crossing arcs, aimed not at center mass, not at the head, but at that weak point. Upper left quadrant, just below the collarbone, where cosmic law's protection had worn thinnest. The blade struck. The barrier shattered. For the first time in the fight, metal touched divine flesh. The blade's bit shallow, barely scratching the surface, drawing blood measured in drops rather than flow. But they connected. Proved the impossible. Showed that cosmic law could be breached when hit hard enough, often enough, with sufficient refusal to accept its authority. Verdict staggered backward, looked down at the wound, at the single thin line of red against marble white skin, at the proof that he could bleed. The god's voice came out hollow. I am judgment. I cannot be. This is... Kratos pulled the blades back, felt the fire pulse along the chains, responding to the kill or be killed clarity that defined moments like this. He was hurt, exhausted, bleeding from a dozen wounds. But Verdict was wounded too. And more importantly, Verdict was broken not physically, but conceptually. The god's entire identity rested on being untouchable, on representing law too absolute to be defied. That identity was bleeding now. Kratos stepped forward, raised the blades for the killing strike, saw Verdict standing there, silver eyes finally showing something human. Not fear, not anger, just incomprehension. The expression of someone whose fundamental understanding of reality had been proven wrong. He could end it now. Drive both blades through that weak point, through the compromised protections, straight into divine flesh. Could kill cosmic judgment and prove once and for all that law was just another thing mortals could destroy when it stood between them and what they loved. His arms tensed. The blades rose higher. Verdict didn't defend himself. Just stood there waiting for the execution he'd spent the entire fight trying to deliver on others. Kratos held the position. 1 second, 2, 3. His conscience, that part of him that had learned from Faye, from Atreus, from the painful process of becoming something other than pure violence, whispered that there was another way. That killing Verdict wasn't necessary. That he'd already won by breaking the barrier, by proving law could bleed, by showing that cosmic authority had limits. But his experienced decades of fighting gods and monsters and discovering that mercy usually bought nothing except a second fight said to finish it. Said that Verdict would recover, would adapt, would find new ways to enforce cosmic law if given the chance. Necessity versus restraint. The choice that defined him. The balance he'd been trying to strike since leaving Greece. He lowered the blades, not in surrender, in decision. "Get up!" His voice came out rough. "We're not done." Verdict looked up at him. Understanding flickered across that inhuman face. "You spare me. I spare you nothing." Kratos stepped back, giving the god room to stand. "I'm just finishing this the right way. Not an execution, a fight." Verdict rose slowly. The wound on his chest was already healing, divine flesh knitting back together. But the barrier didn't reform. Whatever Kratos had broken wasn't something cosmic law could quickly repair. They faced each other across the broken ground, both bleeding, both damaged. Both committed to seeing this through to whatever end came next. In the stands, Atreus was still watching, still refusing to look away. Kratos met his son's eyes for just a moment, nodded once. A message. This is what necessity looks like. This is how you fight when you can't afford to lose. Watch, learn, remember. Then he turned his full attention back to Verdict, raised the blades, and prepared to finish what cosmic law had started. Not through execution, through combat, through proving that even divine judgment could be made to answer for its certainty. The arena held its breath. The moment stretched. And then both fighters moved, and the final exchange began. The arena had gone silent. Not the silence of anticipation, but something deeper. The kind of quiet that came when even gods recognized they were witnessing something that transcended spectacle. Both fighters stood in the crater's center, bloodied and broken in different ways, and the weight of what came next pressed down on everyone watching. Kratos felt it in his bones, the exhaustion that came from pushing past every reasonable limit. His ribs screamed with each breath. His left arm hung slightly lower than it should, nerve damage making fine motor control difficult. Blood ran from cuts across his face, his chest, his arms. The Ragnarok field ensured he felt every injury with perfect clarity. Across from him, Verdict looked diminished. The wound on his chest had closed, but the barrier was gone. That invisible protection that had defined the god's invincibility throughout the fight shattered completely. He stood exposed in a way he'd probably never experienced before, vulnerable, mortal adjacent despite divinity. And the silver eyes that had been so certain now held something that looked almost like doubt. "This is the end." Verdict's voice came steadier than it had any right to. "One way or another. We both know it." Kratos nodded once. Words were unnecessary. They'd said everything that mattered through violence and choice. What remained was simply the conclusion. He adjusted his grip on the blades of chaos. The chains rattled fire flickering along their length. The weapons felt lighter now, not because the weight had changed, but because he'd stopped questioning whether he had the strength to wield them. Necessity had a way of making the impossible feel routine. Verdict raised his hands. No weapon, no book. Just fists that had broken stone and bone throughout the fight. Just the determination of someone who'd realized his certainty couldn't save him, but was choosing to stand anyway. They moved simultaneously. Kratos came in low chains whipping in wide arcs, designed to control space to limit Verdict's movement options. The god dodged left closed distance, drove a palm strike toward Kratos' damaged ribs. The blow landed, sent fresh agony shooting through his torso, but Kratos had already committed to his counter. He wrapped one chain around Verdict's extended arm, yanked hard, and pulled the god off balance. Verdict twisted with the pull, turned it into momentum, drove his knee toward Kratos' head. The strike grazed his temple hard enough to blur his vision. But he'd already released the chain and was pivoting away. Distance. He needed distance to set up the next exchange. They separated, circled, both breathing hard, both calculating. The divine stands were screaming now, some demanding Verdict finish this, others arguing about whether the fight should be stopped, whether both combatants were too damaged to continue safely. Kratos heard fragments of their debate and dismissed it. Safety had stopped being relevant the moment he'd stepped onto this floor. Brunhilde's voice cut through the noise sharp and clear. The law is absolute single combat to the death. Neither fighter has fallen. The battle continues. Thank the Norns for small mercies. At least she understood that stopping now would invalidate everything this fight had proven. Verdict attacked again. A rushing combination punch, elbow, knee, all flowing together with technical precision that belied the god's exhaustion. Kratos blocked the first two, took the knee to his thigh, felt muscle bruise, and threatened to lock up. He countered with an upward slash that Verdict barely dodged the blade, passing within inches of exposed throat. They were both slowing. Damage accumulating. Stamina draining. The fight had gone on longer than either had probably expected, and mortal limitations were asserting themselves regardless of divine origin or legendary reputation. But Kratos had been here before, had fought while bleeding out, while poisoned, while carrying injuries that would have hospitalized normal men for months. The trick wasn't avoiding exhaustion, it was fighting through it, using it. Letting the body's desperate need to survive sharpen instincts that fatigue tried to dull. He feinted left. Verdict bought it, shifted weight to counter. Kratos reversed, came in from the right, and drove his shoulder into the god's center mass. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and chains. Hit the ground hard enough to crater stone beneath them. Kratos came up on top, drove his elbow down toward Verdict's face. The god caught his arm, redirected the strike, and reversed their positions with a roll that put him in the dominant position. His fist came down like a hammer. Kratos turned his head at the last second. The blow struck stone beside his ear, pulverizing rock into powder. He bucked hard, throwing Verdict off, and rolled away. before the follow-up could land. Both fighters scrambled to their feet, putting 5 feet of broken ground between them. In the stands, Atreus was still watching. Kratos could feel the boy's attention like weight against his spine. Could imagine what he was thinking, whether his father was going to win, whether pride was worth this much blood, whether there was any point to fighting when both combatants were destroying themselves. The answer was yes. There was a point, not the victory itself, though, that mattered, but what the victory represented. The proof that cosmic authority could be challenged. That divine decree wasn't absolute. That a mortal who refused to accept judgment could make even gods bleed for their certainty. Atreus needed to see that. Needed to know it was possible. Because the boy's future was going to be defined by impossible situations and authorities that claimed the right to dictate his choices. If he learned now that resistance was futile, that submission was inevitable, then every prophecy and divine scheme would shape him without opposition. But if he learned that even cosmic law could be made to answer for its arrogance, that changed everything. Kratos drew a deep breath, felt his broken ribs protest, ignored the pain, focused on verdict, on the god's stance, on the subtle tells that indicated which way he'd move when pressure was applied. Then he spoke. Not loudly, not theatrically, just clearly enough to carry across the crater. I've learned something fighting you. Verdict's silver eyes narrowed. What control? Kratos shifted his weight, settling into a more grounded stance. I spent decades believing strength meant hitting harder, moving faster, overwhelming opposition through superior force. That's how I fought in Greece. That's how I killed Olympus. He paused. Let the words settle. Let the memory of what he'd been contrast with what he'd become. But that's not strength. That's just violence. Real strength is knowing when to hit, how hard to hit, and what happens after you do. It's using power because you have to, not because you can. The human stands had gone quiet. Even the gods were listening now, caught by the unexpected shift from combat to confession. My son taught me that. Kratos' voice remained steady, though speaking cost him energy he could barely afford to spend. Taught me that being strong enough to destroy everything doesn't mean you should. That having power means choosing when to use it. That necessity is different from opportunity. Verdict's hands lowered slightly. The god was listening too, Silver. Eyes fixed on Kratos with something approaching curiosity. You represent absolute law, Kratos continued. Judgment without mercy. Order without flexibility. You believe strength comes from being right, from having cosmic authority on your side, from never questioning whether your certainty serves justice or just serves itself. He took a step forward. Verdict didn't retreat. But I've killed gods who were certain. Killed titans who believed they were absolute. Killed fate itself when it told me my daughter had to die. Being certain doesn't make you right. It just makes you brittle. And brittle things break when they meet something that refuses to crack. The silence deepened. Heimdall's voice for once didn't fill it. Even the MC seemed to recognize this was a moment that demanded witness, not narration. So, here's what I learned fighting you. Kratos raised the blades of chaos one more time. I learned that I've changed. That the monster who burned Olympus isn't who I am anymore. That I can fight with everything I have and still choose restraint when it matters. That necessity is something I define, not something imposed on me. He met Verdict's eyes across the distance. And I learned that I'm strong enough to use this power when I need it. The shift happened between one heartbeat and the next. Kratos had been holding back, not consciously, not as a tactical decision, but as a reflex. The same reflex that had defined him since leaving Greece, since swearing he'd never become that monster again, since promising himself and Faye and Atreus that rage wouldn't control him anymore. But control didn't mean suppression. It meant choice. And right now, in this moment with his son watching, and cosmic law needing to be taught that mortal will could not be dismissed, he chose to stop holding back. The Spartan rage ignited. Not the mindless fury of his Greek days, not the uncontrolled berserker state that had defined the ghost of Sparta. This was different. Controlled. Directed. The same overwhelming power, but filtered through discipline, through purpose, through the hard-won understanding that strength served the user's intent. His vision sharpened. Pain receded, not gone, but distant, irrelevant to what needed doing. His muscles surged with energy that came from somewhere deeper than stamina. Some reserve the body kept for moments when survival demanded exceeding normal limits. The fire along the blades of chaos intensified, turned from red to white hot. The chains seemed to sing as they moved, harmonizing with the controlled fury that now defined every movement. Verdict's eyes widened. What? Kratos didn't let him finish. Crossed the distance in 3 explosive strides and drove both blades forward in strikes aimed with surgical precision. Not at center mass, not at the head, at joints, at tendons, at the places where cosmic flesh met divine bone and damage would compromise mobility without killing. Because he wasn't trying to execute Verdict anymore. He was trying to end the fight the right way. Through superior skill backed by controlled power. Through proving that mortal will could overcome cosmic decree not through brutality, but through precision. The first blade struck Verdict's left shoulder, bit through flesh and muscles, severed connections that made the arm functional. The god's left side dropped useless. The second blade came in low, sliced across the back of his right knee. Verdict's leg buckled. He went down to one knee, tried to rise. Couldn't. The damage was too precise, too calculated to allow recovery. Kratos stood over him. The rage still burned, but he controlled it absolutely. Let it fuel him without consuming him. This was what he'd learned. This was the balance. Power used because it was necessary stopped before it became excessive. He raised both blades, crossed them, pressed the burning edges against Verdict's throat, not cutting, just holding. One motion would finish it, would sever head from shoulders and end cosmic judgment permanently. Yield. Kratos' voice came out rough but clear. Or die. Choose. Verdict looked up at him. The silver eyes held no fear, just acceptance, understanding maybe. If I yield, I acknowledge you were right. That cosmic law can be defied. That judgment is not absolute. Yes. That destroys everything I am, everything I represent. I know. Kratos pressed the blades fractionally closer. Choose anyway. For 5 seconds, Verdict remained silent. The arena held its breath. Gods and humans alike waited to see whether cosmic judgment would prefer death to admitting fallibility. Then Verdict spoke, his voice carrying across the sudden stillness. I yield. The words hit like thunder. The divine stands erupted in chaos, some gods shouting denials, others arguing about whether yielding counted as death for tournament purposes. Still others simply shocked that cosmic law had bent. Heimdall's voice rose above them, all the MC's theatrical nature serving him well as he processed the unprecedented. Yield. The god of judgment has yielded. But the law states combat must end in death. What is the ruling? Brunhilde's response came immediate and sharp. Yielding in the face of certain death counts as defeat. The law is satisfied. The challenger has won. The human stands exploded in noise. Disbelief and celebration mixing together in equal measure. They'd watched one of their own, or at least someone who'd chosen to represent them, defeat a god. Not through divine advantage, not through cosmic intervention, but through will and skill and the fundamental refusal to accept imposed judgment. But Kratos barely heard any of it. His focus remained on verdict on the god kneeling before him, with blades pressed against divine throat. Why? The question came out quiet, meant only for the two of them. You could have chosen death, maintained your certainty to the end. Why yield? Verdict's silver eyes met his. For the first time, they looked almost human. Because you were right. Being certain doesn't make me correct. It just makes me brittle. And I broke. A pause. Then softer. And because yielding takes more courage than dying. Death is easy. Living with being wrong is hard. Kratos held the position for one more heartbeat. Then he withdrew the blades, stepped back, let verdict collapse fully onto the broken ground. The Spartan rage faded, drained out of him as quickly as it had come, leaving behind the exhaustion it had temporarily masked. Kratos swayed, caught himself, forced his legs to lock and keep him upright. He'd won. The fight was over. Cosmic law had bent. The point was proven. Now he just had to stay conscious long enough to acknowledge it. Heimdall raised the Gjallar horn. The sound that emerged was clear and pure, cutting through all the chaos. When silence fell, his voice carried absolute certainty. Victory! Kratos of Sparta stands triumphant. The ghost has proven mortal will can challenge divine decree. The first battle of Ragnarok concludes humanity claims 1 point. The human stands erupted again. But this time Kratos let himself look toward them. Let himself search the crowd until he found Atreus. The boy was standing, hands gripping the railing, face split between relief and pride and lingering fear. Their eyes met. Kratos nodded once. The same message he'd sent before. This is what necessity looks like. This is how you fight when you can't afford to lose. This is how you use power when you need it, how you need it stopped before it becomes who you are. Atreus nodded back. Understanding written across his face. Brunhilde appeared at the crater's edge, her expression carefully neutral, but eyes showing satisfaction. Can you walk? No. Kratos took a step toward her anyway. His knee buckled. She caught him before he fell surprisingly strong for someone who looked like she'd been built for grace rather than load-bearing. Then let me help. She shifted her grip, supporting his weight without making it look like support. Maintaining dignity, even in collapse. You've earned it. Together they climbed out of the crater. Behind them, other figures, Valkyrie's Kratos realized, descended to retrieve verdict. The god was still conscious, still breathing, but the defeat had hollowed him out. He looked smaller somehow, less like cosmic authority given form, and more like a being who'd believed something that turned out to be wrong. Kratos understood that feeling intimately, had lived with it for years after Greece. They reached the arena's edge. Atreus was already there, having sprinted down from the stands. The boy looked like he wanted to embrace his father, but was afraid of causing more damage. I'm fine. Kratos' voice came out rougher than intended. Broken ribs aren't fatal. You look like you got hit by a mountain. Atreus' attempt at levity didn't quite mask the worry underneath. Mountains don't hit this precisely. Kratos allowed himself a small acknowledgement of pain. But I've survived worse. That's not as reassuring as you think it is. Despite everything, the exhaustion, the pain, the weight of what he'd just done, Kratos felt the corner of his mouth twitch, almost a smile, close enough to count. Behind them, Heimdall's voice was already building toward the next pronouncement. The first battle concludes, but the war for survival continues. 12 battles remain. Both sides must choose their next champions. The arena will witness more glory, more sacrifice, more. Kratos stopped listening. Let the words wash over him like weather. His part in this particular fight was done. Other warriors would take the stage. Other stories would unfold. For now, he was finished. Well, almost finished. He turned back toward the arena one last time. Looked at Verdict being carried away by Valkyries. The god's silver eyes found his across the distance. A moment of connection between victor and defeated. Acknowledgement that they'd both learned something in the violence. Then Verdict was gone, carried into whatever recovery awaited divine beings who'd been taught humility through force. Kratos let Brunhilde guide him toward the medical chambers. Let Atreus walk beside him, the boy's presence a reminder of why any of this mattered. Let the exhaustion finally start pulling him down, now that consciousness was no longer necessary for survival. Behind them, the council was already arguing about what the fight had proven, about whether Kratos should be allowed to fight again, if needed, about how to counter the psychological impact of watching cosmic law bend. Let them argue. Let them scheme. Let them convince themselves they could control narratives and outcomes. Kratos had proven the only point that mattered, that authority could be challenged when it overreached, that certainty could be made to doubt itself, and that mortal will, when backed by skill and necessity, could make even gods reconsider their decrees. The rest was just details. In the medical chamber, Brunhilde helped him onto a bench carved from stone. Valkyries moved around them, preparing supplies, discussing the extent of his injuries in clinical terms that suggested most of them were survivable. Atreus stood nearby, arms crossed, trying to look calm and failing. So, that was necessary, Kratos finished. The word felt right, felt true. Nothing more, nothing less. You scared me. The admission came out quiet, honest. When he hit you and you kept getting up, I thought you weren't going to stop. That you'd just keep standing until I won. Kratos met his son's eyes. That's what you do. When the fight matters, when lives depend on the outcome, you don't stop because it hurts. You stop when it's finished. Atreus absorbed that, nodded slowly. And if I'm ever in that situation, you'll know what to do. Kratos allowed himself to close his eyes, trusting the Valkyries to handle the medical side while he handled the staying conscious side. Because you've watched it happen. You know it's possible. That's more than I had when I started. Silence fell over the chamber. Comfortable. The kind that came when words weren't necessary because understanding already existed. From outside, the arena's noise continued. The council arguing, the gods scheming. The next fighters being selected. The tournament grinding forward through its predetermined structure toward whatever conclusion awaited at 7 victories. But in this moment, Kratos allowed himself something he rarely permitted satisfaction, not pride. Pride had always been dangerous, had always led him toward mistakes he couldn't undo. But satisfaction that he'd done what needed doing, had proven what needed proving, and had taught his son a lesson that couldn't be communicated through words alone. that sometimes necessity demanded power, and sometimes being strong enough meant knowing exactly when to use it and when to stop. The ghost of Sparta had walked into that arena carrying the weight of his history, carrying the expectations of humanity, carrying the knowledge that failure meant more than just his death. And he'd walked out, limped out, having proven that cosmic law was just another obstacle to be overcome when it stood between him and what mattered. The rest could wait. For now, that was enough. Outside, Heimdall's voice rang out one final time, proclaiming the glory of combat and the inevitability of more battles to come. Inside, Kratos let himself rest. Let the exhaustion take him down into something approaching sleep. And in the space between consciousness and oblivion, he felt Atreus's hand briefly touch his shoulder. A silent acknowledgement. A quiet pride. That was worth every broken rib, every torn muscle, every moment of pain that had brought him to this point. Worth it and more. The tournament would continue. Other fights would unfold. But Kratos had accomplished what mattered most. He'd shown his son that even impossible odds could be challenged when necessity demanded it. Everything else was just the aftermath. And the ghost of Sparta had always been good at surviving those.